Bro, MMA is so much better than boxing. You'd never see boxers take these big fights on short notice, bro. Okay, obviously that take is still absolutely correct, and I agree with it. But I think the UFC still has a short notice fight problem right now. And so in this video, we're going to go over why the UFC needs to stop being so adamant about quote unquote saving every single fight possible with short notice opponents. You know, this year, of course, we've had quite a few short notice fights, and very horribly. Most infamously was Volk at UFC 294. I think I'm still a little depressed about that one. And most recently, we saw Bryce Mitchell get literally murdered at UFC 296 after stepping in on short notice. That's not all bad, of course. You know, there was still plenty of great short notice fights this year. Most notably was, of course, Tom Aspinall.
Have you ever been fingered by an MMA fighter before?
But short notice fights still have a lot of issues, so let's go over some of them and then talk about how we can fix this issue. First up is the original fighter has everything to lose. You know, as much as we like to joke with John Royds Bones Jones, there's a reason he would refuse short notice opponents, because both sides aren't prepared, and that's a risk you don't want to be taking at the highest level. The original fighter looks bad if he loses because his opponent is on short notice. Often short notice guys are lower ranked than the original opponent too, meaning they'll be punished more for a loss, and the fight is not nearly as important as it was supposed to be. A good example is one that happened earlier this year at UFC 292. Neal Magny stepped in on short notice for Geoff Neal after he had to pull out against Garry due to some health issues, and of course we know Neal Magny got absolutely whooped. And what happened? Garry's at the exact same spot anyways, with another fight with Geoff Neal being rebooked for a couple months from now, I believe at UFC 298 or 299. Basically, with that fight, all we saw happen was, because we had a lower ranked opponent step in compared to the original with Neal Magny compared to Geoff Neal, that Garry didn't actually even get to move up at all despite how badly he embarrassed him, and now he's just at the exact same spot booking that same fight, you know, in several months in the future, whereas, you know, we could have just rebooked the Neal fight to be in the fall, and now Garry would already be at the same spot. He's going to have to now wait till March to be in, because the UFC was so insistent on getting a short notice opponent for him. Now, on one hand, it might also seem the short notice opponent has nothing to lose, and it only sucks for the original fighter, and the short notice fighter has everything to gain. I'd argue this isn't the case either. Of course, as we talked about earlier, Alexander Volkanovski stepping in on short notice against Islam Makhachev at UFC 294 in their rematch, Volk destroyed his chances of becoming a double champ. The first fight was competitive, so Volk had a pretty much guaranteed rematch card, but he wasted it by taking the fight on the worst possible conditions. You know, coming off the couch and being in Makhachev's home territory, and in a territory where Makhachev is going to get the absolute best amount of rehydration and all these things compared to their first fight. And sure, it's not as big of a name, but Gamrot was already the backup. They should have just let him fight because, you know, he just came out of the fight with Fiziev, so he just came out of training camp. So maybe he didn't have the game plan for Makhachev, but he would have been in a lot better shape than Volk was. And to be honest, it would have been a much more competitive fight. I don't think he would have won, but I think he would have at least made it out of the first round, unlike Volk. Or at the very least, if you're worried about being able to sell the card, let Poirier take the fight instead, since again, same idea. He wasn't in talks for a title shot, just in the same way Gamrot wasn't in talks for a title shot. So it's not too bad to go in on bad conditions compared to never going in at all. However, I would argue it's worse to go in on bad conditions when you know you've got a shot to go in later. Now what? Do we just force people to fight injured? Of course not. I guess unless you really want to. TJ Dillashaw. But what should we do when people pull out? We still need the card to have big names on it. I'd argue what is better off is that whenever possible, push the fight back to a later date. Now you might say, but a card will get worse if it loses big fights. Well, now the next card will get another big fight on it, and it evens out, because it will essentially be a flywheel effect. UFC 298 might lose a big fight, but now 299 is going to gain one. But luckily, a fight from 297 had to be pushed back to 298, so now it all works out. In that case, 297 still loses one, but in a world where this consistently happens, it would fall back to UFC 297, getting pushed back fights from prior cards, and so on. I get this won't always happen, you know, it's not going to be one-to-one pushing back, and of course, sometimes the injury is much more severe, and you can't push a fight back 6 months to let that person fully recover. But when it's something like a minor injury, infection, or visa issues, why not just push it back a few weeks? For the reasons covered earlier, it's better to get the original fight later rather than not at all. Since let's be honest, like 90% of the time when we say, wow, this short notice opponent is even better than the original fight, that's kind of just cope a lot of the time. A lot of people were saying that with Kamaru Usman and Volk at 294, but let's be real, that was not better than what the original card would have been, since they were coming in on short notice, and so they weren't properly prepared. Now, of course, main events aren't something you can really be pushing back like that, especially for a pay-per-view, but in that case, I think it's the best bet for the fighters who know they've got a title shot locked in to wait. So as I suggested earlier, maybe the best idea for those is often taking someone who might not have got a title shot other ways, like Dustin Poirier or Gamrot in the UFC 294 situation, rather than waste what could have been a banger fight in a proper Makhachev versus Volk 2, which we're now never going to get, unfortunately. Now, one last criticism you might have of this idea of pushing back fights is that fighters don't get paid a lot and only get paid when they fight, which means if they get their fight pushed back, their paycheck also gets pushed back. Of course, that's an issue, but if the UFC actually paid fighters well, then this wouldn't be nearly as big of a one. Ideally, we would be able to fix both fighter pay and these short notice fight issues, but that's probably being a little bit too optimistic. I'm not completely against short notice opponents if it's a further out short notice, like say 1 month, but these short notice fights constantly being made on like a week's notice are rarely ending well. So I think we'd be better off pushing more fights back rather than making often poor replacements. I get it, it sucks for the fight to get pushed back, but I'd rather get that fight pushed back than to not get that fight at all. But comment down below what you think. Agree or completely disagree. I'll be sure to respond as soon as I can, but without further ado, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.